Hey guys, how's it going? Kripparrian here. So I gave you guys a bit of a tip on the best cards in the Battlegrounds. Learning from the best. It turns out we got number one for basically the first 24 hours in the world in Battlegrounds rankings. That's right. So I do know what I'm talking about. If you guys do choose to follow my advice, you should do pretty well. And I'm streaming all week. Streaming all day, all week. So I'm probably streaming right now. Go over to twitch.tv /NL_Krip, and there I am playing some Battlegrounds for you guys, kicking ass. That's right. Now, you want to know what the best 10 heroes are, because when the game starts, it's really important to start your way to success the right way. Now, the way the hero system works is there's 8 players in the game, there's 24 heroes total, and you get one option of 3 if you have all the unlocks and all that kind of stuff. So what that means is every hero has representation. So it's pretty important to pick the right ones because you're going to be up against the right ones fairly often. Top 10. Let's start with number 10, Shudder Walk. Shudder Walk you might think is like the best hero ever, but it's not the best hero ever, but it's pretty good. Above average. Top 10 of 24. Not bad, right? Double Battle Cry is very strong, but it costs 2 mana. Because it costs 2 mana, imagine this way. If you're picking a card for a Battle Cry effect, you're typically doing that at 3 mana, or 3 gold, let's say. So if you're using 3 gold instead of doubling for 2 gold, well, that's really only a 1 gold savings. So it's not that big a deal. And you typically want to stack your late game units, not your early game units. You don't really want to double battle cry your early game units. There's some exceptions with tokens, but it's pretty advanced play. Typically, I see Shudder Walks get knocked out first because they're trying to use their hero power more than they should. The way that you use Shudder Walk is outside of fringe scenarios with tokens and breakpoints in the gold early on, you basically don't use the hero power at all until the late game, and that's when it starts to be quite economically sound. And it's actually a pretty good hero power. It's a pretty good hero. You just have to play it the right way. You have to pretend like your hero power doesn't exist until you get basically to the end of the mid game or the start of the late game. That's when Shudder Walk starts to do pretty well. But until then, don't even touch it if you don't know what you're doing. Next up is George the Fallen. Very much the same way. Give a dude Divine Shield. That's a huge deal. But it's 4 gold hero power. The only way that you want to spend 4 gold to give a Divine Shield is if you know you're using that minion forever. When do you know that? Very late in the game. You do not use this hero power under any circumstances until you know for sure 100% it's on a minion you will keep until the end of the game. That means George does not have a hero power going from the early game to the mid game to the early late game. You do not have a hero power, which means you need to play pretty aggressively in order to have something going on near the end of the game. You can't do one of those like late bloom starts and, kind of hope it works out. With George, it's not going to. So George is very good. Divine Shield is one of the most powerful options to put on your minions, and George can do it on any minion. That's crazy. But, there's a big but. Don't use this unless you know you're keeping the guy. Yoggsaron, that's a pretty interesting one. He recruits a random. It costs 2 and it gets +1/+1. Yoggsaron typically excels extremely well in the early game and the mid game, and in the late game, he basically doesn't really have a hero power. But what that means is if you do well in the early and the mid, you're kind of guaranteed like top 4 unless you make some mistakes and stuff. So I feel Yoggsaron deserves a top 10 spot because if you pick Yoggsaron, you're not going to really go bottom 4 a whole lot. So that's pretty good. You don't have to get first place to rank up in the Battlegrounds. If you hit top 4, your ranking goes up. So if you want your ranking to go up, you pick Yoggsaron because he does really well consistently. Even though he doesn't win a whole lot, he gets to the last few spots nearly all of the time. Next up, AFK. Basically exactly the same as Yoggsaron. Rarely wins games, but seems to get like 2nd and 3rd in just about every single game someone plays AFK. The way that AFK works is you do nothing for the first 2 turns. You can, however, lock the board. If you see like a good double or a triple, you can lock that for when you can actually act, which is the 3rd turn. On the 3rd turn, you can discover a tavern cost 3 and 4 minion. And typically when you do this, typically, not always, but typically you are unstoppable for a few rounds. So losing the early game is not that big a deal because you don't typically take that much damage. Now, if you're guaranteed to win the mid game, and you usually are playing AFK, you basically always make it to the late game. As a result, AFK is an excellent choice for a top 4 finisher, despite the fact that she doesn't usually win. Well, getting second or third, that's basically a win. Queen Tog Waggle basically does the big archetypes. Buff your guys if you're playing a Murloc, if you're playing all the goodness, and you've seen me on stream. Playing this type of like menagerie build is extremely strong. And if you're playing even like a few of them, even a couple of them, it's kind of worth a 1 gold hero power. So she just has consistent push on the board. If you get those early amalgams, she just gets pretty out of control. You get value even if you hit 2 things. And if you're keeping those 2 things the whole game, that's a lot of value that tends to build up. Typically in the very late game, you're looking for a lot of health, and if you can stick poisonous on those amalgamized or similar dudes, well, that's a pretty big win. So Queen Togwaggle just does very well all the way through. You kind of have to stick to the strategy, but this strategy is very flexible, so you're not really at a disadvantage. Maleficent Manastorm, she gets +1/+1 on mechs. Now, it happens that mechs are really good right now. So, she's really good right now. It's very hard to do badly with Manastorm, but that could change if they change the cards, if they change the meta. If mechs are actually not good at all, well, Manastorm is not going to be very good. But right now, mechs are excellent, and amalgams are excellent, and amalgams are mechs. So she basically covers most of what's good in the game. Mechs are pretty good in the early game, excellent mid-range, and excellent late game. And because she has the +1/+1 in the early game, those okay early game mechs, those are also really insane. So you can go pretty much full unstoppable as Manastorm if you stick to the mechs, and you probably should. Next up is the Rat King. The Rat King is kind of like the menagerie version of Manastorm. You don't always get to choose your hero power because it cycles. So you're going to get the buff to like beasts, then next turn it's going to be like demons, then it's going to be like beasts again or something. So it can be very tough to figure this out. There is some advanced level play where you can choose to tavern up and freeze in order to possibly wait for your type to show up. It's pretty advanced level play. I encourage you guys to experiment, but yes, mistakes can be made when being greedy with freezes and tavern ups. But the Rat King, because of his buff, because it always starts on a beast, because there's almost always a beast in your first 3 options, he almost always wins the early game. He does very well in the mid game, and in the late game, well, he's a little bit weaker, but it still does pretty well. You're going to find that this buff carries quite nicely, especially in the late game when you're re-rolling for triples. That's right. Top 3. Number 3, and honestly, I think the top 3 are a bit interchangeable. I think they are in their own category as the best 3 classes in Battlegrounds. Number 3 is the Curator. So the Curator, he just starts with an amalgam. It's a 1/1 amalgam, but it is unlike the normal amalgam card, which means you can have both at any time on the board. You can actually have 2 level 1 amalgams and the Curator amalgam. You can have 3 amalgams on your board as the Curator. This is crazy insane. Let me just put it that way. Curator just goes super insane. Any card that buffs anything throughout the entire game is going to buff what is essentially your starting hero power. Amalgam is the best minion in the game, and Curator starts with 1. That's pretty ridiculous. Number 2 is Infinite Toki. Infinite Toki can refresh, and the last guy on the board is guaranteed to be from the next Tavern tier. So what does this mean? First off, this means that you never need to go to Tavern tier in 6 because you're going to get constant Tavern tier 6 dudes through the Toki hero power. So you just saved a bunch of gold because you'll never have to go to Tavern tier 6. You just stay on 5 for the entire game. Now, this hero is more powerful than I had thought originally. This is why. Let's say you are Tavern Tier 6. If you're constantly refreshing, you'll notice that you actually don't get Tavern Tier 6 minions very often. Toki guarantees 1 if you're Tavern Tier 5. So you're probably seeing about as many or maybe even more depending on how many times you reroll, Tavern Tier 6 minions if you're 5 as Toki than you are if you're 6 as anything else. That's super crazy. The fact that you can high roll a build-defining 6-star card when you just hit 5 as Toki is mind-blowingly strong. Toki also, you can use this ability throughout the game. You're typically going to have okay early game, very powerful mid game, and like soul-crushing late game. So if you just hang in there, good chances are that you're just going to win the late game because of your hero power. So Infinite Toki does very well. And number 1, should not be a surprise to many, is Nefarian. So Nefarian, for 1 gold, he does 1 damage to everything. You do not use this in the early game. You do not use this in the late game. But most powerful late game strategies involve lots of divine shields. And what Nefarian does is remove all of them before combat starts. So in the late game, Nefarian is going to win games. If you're a good player, Nefarian is probably the best hero in the entire game. Because if you can just through your skills get top 4, Nefarian is going to take that 4th place and convert it to 1st a lot of the time. That's what Nefarian does. That's what you should be doing. Hope you guys learned a lot, and we'll see you guys in the next one.